Hello, my name is Darren Hedley, and I'll be sharing with you today on the topic of reaching our global development goals through the empowerment of pro-social protagonists. Um, and it's my humble effort to correlate Bahá'í teachings to the important set of discourses in global development. Now, global or international development is a large multidisciplinary area. There's many systems and disciplines involved, so it makes it a bit complicated to map the field and see how to correlate teachings with these various discourses. But I'll try and draw out some overarching principles while contributing to the learning. So now I'm going to share my screen. So the background for this is a paper that was published in Frontiers in Sociology. It was one of a series of articles on the topic of Sustainable Development Goal number 16 for peace, justice, and strong institutions. And my paper was From Stakeholders to Protagonists, an exploratory framework for cultivating pro-social capacities for development. These ideas are shaped by my work in international development for 35 years and teaching at university for the last 5 years in global development, and of course, as a member of the Baha'i faith. Um, and I'm trying to contribute to the work that ABS is really championing in discourse engagement, and we're called on to do in the 9-year plan. And I was motivated also because I wanted to share my vision with my colleagues and with students, which I have then subsequently put on course reading lists. So today I'll talk about the current situation in sustainable global development, something which may be new for many people. So I wanted to dwell on that a little bit more. And then the Baha'i approach to global development, in particular prosociality or nobility and protagonists, and then share some conclusions. So the current situation in global development, a mixture of progress, stagnation, learning. So first, I want to ask you to think for a second, what do you think about global development? What comes to your mind? Because the frames we adopt shape our thinking. So for example, if you think of problems, then that gives one line to your thinking. Which ones are you thinking of? Different people focus on different problems based on their ideologies, disciplines, their knowledge and exposure. Or do you think of solutions, perhaps methods, approaches? And if so, which ones? Again, people will differ. Do you think of resources, such as financial or other types of resources? Do you think of service and service delivery or capacities? This is a crucial one for me, and I think it's central in the Baha'i framing of development. Is development a material or a spiritual process, or both? And if it's both, how should they be combined? Now, do you know that we have global development goals? So this is also one way of framing our thinking about global development. But then who is responsible for achieving those goals? Who are the protagonists, as we will call it today? And are we failing or succeeding with these goals? And in the process, are we learning anything about development? So first of all, this global development actually means all of us. And the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations do apply to all countries. We have to be cautious of a tendency to assume that we in the North have the answers, and we just have to apply those around the world. And we know there's a current emphasis on decolonizing many aspects of society. So we have to recognize we have challenges at home that need to be addressed. Homeless people, the conditions of minority groups are often lamentable. How can we help people develop capacities for decent life? Homelessness is a growing problem in Calgary. So development often is seen as a response to problems, such as a lack of something, a lack of water supplies, lack of food, housing, electricity, and so on. And a lack of decent water often affects women and girls in particular who can be put in unsafe conditions when accessing these basic human rights. So we always have to understand the differential impact of problems on different subgroups of society. Here's a young girl carrying water in Goma, DRC. But we have to also read the reality, and the development field does this. We know that the water shortage is reflecting climate change gradual effects, and there's a serious problem here. 4 billion people are living in areas which have extreme water scarcity for 1 month of the year, and 500 million face that problem year-round. So water scarcity could be caused by demand exceeding supply, inadequate infrastructure, institutions failing to balance everyone's needs. It's important, therefore, to empower people to participate in water supply systems, but to understand the causality. And a lack of food is a clear one that we need to address. Here we see an internally displaced woman in Sudan serving wild boiled leaves to orphan children. And that's really a sign of desperation when people are doing that. And this situation is caused by climate-induced drought as well as conflict. And in this case, they've responded to another climate-induced problem of flooding with humanitarian assistance. In our climate environment reading group with ABS, we have been exploring the multiple effects of climate change on people of the world and the possible ways that we can draw on Baha'i teachings to prompt more sympathetic and effective responses among the peoples of the world. Now, another solution often touted has been empowerment through microfinance. But it's no longer seen as the silver bullet it once was seen. It's giving way to less risky savings and loans options. But these new approaches require more emphasis on mutual self-help, also strategic relationships with services, support services, banks, etc. So all these things need to be developed in systems. And another new area relatively is market system resilience, in recognition that the stability of farmers, retailers, traders, often these are simple folks from communities along with the farmers. And the survival of those markets is also important as communities face shocks caused by climate change, conflict, pandemics, geopolitical problems. And so it requires collaboration of all these actors. In arid zones, we've seen one of the solutions is water harvesting, such as the Zai pits shown here, or semi-moon, where they're able to capture rainwater, the little that there is, and improve agriculture productivity. Connected with this is the Africa's Great Green Wall initiative. It was a great idea, but it requires a lot of coordination among various actors and consistent voluntary efforts from the communities, but it's still yielding valuable results and learning. Another area is integrity. I worked on the Water Integrity Global Outlook Report 2021, where corruption is seen as an absence of adequate participation, transparency, and accountability. And they break down those things and have had quite good results within the water sector. But often it doesn't go far enough at addressing corruption at higher levels. Another promising approach has been empowering women's health groups that rely often on women who lead these health groups, become educated and share that with others. But they need to devote some time in service to the community, which is an important capacity. And they're often working with women's groups within a network of broader communities and institutions. One of the successful projects I helped evaluate was the Shoharda project in Bangladesh. It achieved a reduction of child chronic malnutrition from 56 to 40% through integrated approaches, including gender empowerment and livestock development. So there's great learning and some great results happening. And there is a global architecture that we also have to take heart from for the development and human rights. From 1945 onwards, we've had the United Nations with its Declaration of Human Rights, and then significant moments such as the UN Decade for Women, Decade for Water, Agenda 21, and then the development goals from 2000 to 2015, millennium, and currently the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a great expression of world unity and an agreement that we have to address poverty. We have to address hunger, health and well-being, education, water, and environment, and so on. So what are some of the results in quantitative terms? Well, there has been progress in reducing those living in extreme poverty, defined as the $2.15 per day income, down from 2 billion in 1990 to about 700 million in 2024. So that's a reduction. An absolute increase of numbers in this group here in blue, the sub-Saharan Africa, but reductions of absolute numbers in other parts of the world. But it's important that we pay attention to whether we're talking about absolute numbers or percentages. Here, the share of population in extreme poverty has dropped from going back to 1820, when it was most of the people in Africa. Now it's down to about 40% in sub-Saharan Africa as a percentage, and the rest of the world also has seen that kind of a drop. Now, hunger also had been falling since 2005. It was at 700 million, 800 million people, and it fell to 560 in 2014-15, but it gradually started to rise, especially with the COVID pandemic, and it's reached levels that are as nearly as bad as they ever were. So we have to overcome this challenge. Hunger is measured by amount undernourishment from the FAO standard. Your energy needs are not adequate. Your consumption not adequate to your needs. Now, child mortality is an interesting case where really I think this epitomizes how we should look at the world. The world is awful. We still have so many challenges, but the world is much better than it was, but it can be much better still. All of these statements are true at the same time, but people tend to latch onto one or the other. It's awful. 4.4% of all children are dying before they're 15 years old. But it is improved. In the past, around 50% of all children died. And it can still be better. In EU countries, less 0.5% of children die. So that's what we have to strive towards. So we need to continue to work on progress and address the stagnation. There has been progress with the SDGs, but there are big setbacks. COVID-19, compounded by the Ukraine war, climate crises are always there. And we still have around 1 billion people, give or take, with lacking basic water, food, energy. And then climate change is a big looming crisis, I will call it. The world is on track for 3.1 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels, which is leading to increased droughts, flood, diseases, plants, animals, people, sea level rise, heat waves, wildfires, and all of this especially affects the poorest who have limited adaptation means. Soil degradation, 90% of the land could be degraded by 2050. We're losing almost 5 million hectares of forests a year, and we still have to deal with a larger population, 11 billion, and all their needs and their growing wastes and environmental impacts. So more global solidarity is needed. The UN has said that the SDGs are disappearing in the rearview mirror, as is the hope and rights of current and future generations. We're not going to reach most of the SDGs, frankly. For example, SDG 6 on water, sanitation, and hygiene, it needs a fourfold increase in support in order to reach its goal. And the international community has aimed to dedicate 0.7% of its gross national income in international development assistance. But the average among OECD or wealthy countries is only 0.33%. And it is projected to fall by up to 17% this year, and it fell 9% in the last year. So the question we have to ask is, what percentage of our wealth are we willing to share with the world's poorest? And material means are definitely part of the solution for development. But then we come to the question of how the Baha'i community sees this challenge of global development. And I assume that most people here have some understanding of many of these topics. So but it's good to look at the Baha'i international community statements on development. So what do you think is the Baha'i viewpoint on development? What would you say to people? For example, if someone says the world is in deep trouble, how would you respond to that? You might talk about key principles such as the unity of humankind, elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty, obviously applicable here, equality of women and men, justice, honesty, integrity. Consultation is often seen as an important Baha'i principle, participation, learning, and capacity building. So those are familiar topics among development professionals, and so people will have an implicit understanding of them. But then there's some more edgy topics in which the Baha'i faith has something more meaningful and innovative to share. Huququllah, the right of God. It's a voluntary spiritualized wealth redistribution mechanism. World government, something you don't hear about very often. Voluntary service to the community. It's fundamental for the approach of protagonists that we'll talk about. And the unity of science and religion, which really leads to the question of adding the spiritual dimension to development. It's the most obvious difference in the Baha'i approach. In Ruhi Book 13, we read that material civilization is like a lamp glass. Divine civilization is the lamp itself, and the glass without the light is dark. Dr. Arbab wrote that we work with like-minded people seeking solutions to humanity's problems, while noting that a change in the human heart is required. And he referred to the House of Justice. Behind so much of the turbulence and commotion of contemporary life are the fits and starts of a humanity struggling to come of age. Widely accepted practices and conventions, cherished attitudes and habits are one by one being rendered obsolete as the imperatives of maturity begin to assert themselves. So this is from Dr. Arbab's wonderful ABS lecture on the intellectual life of the Baha'i community. And he then concludes that we need to promote spiritually sound practices, conventions, habits, and attitudes. And in my article in Frontiers, I state that global crises require more transformative approaches to capacity strengthening. I say that it would seem naive for us to think that by continuing the same strategies that have been used for decades, humanity will be able to meet the needs of today. So we this document for the betterment of the world by the Baha'i international community, we read key Baha'i principles. Humanity is moving towards its collective maturity. So there's a dual process of disintegration and reconstruction, which helps us to put in perspective what we see happening in the world. And then the principles of oneness and justice and reconceptualizing societal relations, in particular, the equality of women and men, and the coherence between the spiritual and material. Also, that learning is our key mode of operation. And again, we draw on both religious and scientific knowledge. And then participation is referred to here. I know that from the participation we learn about in Book 13, it's a very deep-rooted approach based on knowledge and spiritual capacities of the participants. We draw on organic growth of development, depending on grassroots stirrings, first and foremost. And then complexity in development initiatives emerges only naturally. And capacity building is really the source of empowerment for people. So prosociality and protagonists are key concepts for Baha'i community development, community building in our Baha'i community, and also can be applicable for international development. So first of all, prosociality. A lot of development practice and discourse is getting bogged down with a negative view of human nature. And therefore, we need to, in our public discourse, articulate that people have a potential and capability for nobility, but it just needs to be strengthened. As Baha'u'llah wrote, "Noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created. And this is a good one that we can share with people. But we also have to emphasize to people that our orientation should be towards oneness, a more pro-social orientation rather than a pro-self. And this is where I get the word prosociality, social meaning relating to society or organization. But then the protagonists, the development field does recognize that there are many actors that need to be involved in development. But in Bahá'í.org, it nicely states that we're living a unique period in history as humanity emerges from childhood and approaches a collective maturity. The need for a new understanding of the relationships between the individual, the community, and the institutions of society becomes ever more pressing. The interdependence of these three protagonists and civilization has to be recognized. Old paradigms of conflict in which institutions demand submission while individuals clamor for freedom need to be replaced with more profound conceptions of the complementary roles to be played by each in building a better world. And then to accept that the individual, the community, and the institutions of society are the protagonists of civilization building, and to act accordingly opens up great possibilities for human happiness, allows for the creation of environments in which the true powers of the human spirit can be released. So this is why we're talking about empowerment in this context. So a little bit more on prosociality, or the noble or higher nature of humans. First of all, in the Baha'i teachings, we learn about the dual human nature. There are two natures, Abdul Baha says, his spiritual or higher nature and his material or lower nature. In one, he approaches God, and the other, he lives for the world alone. Signs of both these natures are to be found in men. And Baha'u'llah writes, man should know his own self and recognize that which leadeth unto loftiness or lowliness, glory or abasement, wealth or poverty. And then the House of Justice wrote in its wonderful message of the promise of world peace some decades ago, so much have aggression and conflict come to characterize our social, economic, and religious systems that many have succumbed to the view that such behavior is intrinsic to human nature and therefore ineradicable. With the entrenchment of this view, a paralyzing contradiction has developed in human affairs. On one hand, people proclaim not only their readiness, but their longing for peace and harmony, for an end to the apprehensions tormenting their daily lives. On the other hand, uncritical assent is given to the idea that human beings are selfish and aggressive, and thus incapable of erecting a social system progressive and peaceful, dynamic, and harmonious, a system that gives free play to individual creativity and initiative, but based on cooperation and reciprocity. And it's most fundamentally based on the glorification of material pursuits. So these are well-known foundational Baha'i teachings. So then how do we start to carry this out to the wider society? A lot of literature does address the collaborative potential of people, such as Michael Carlberg's book on mutualism, Nava Ashraf and colleagues on altruistic capital, and many other writers. The prosocial idea, according to Atkins, is just getting along and cooperating with others to benefit others and society as a whole. This is published in Atkins' book, by the way, called Using Evolutionary Science to Build Productive, Equitable, and Collaborative Groups. A very interesting approach. So the term prosociality is similar to being cooperative, service-oriented, caring, peaceful, ethical, moral, collaborative. It can describe functioning of communities and institutions as well as individuals. And it's both a characteristic of those protagonists, and it's a frame through which we perceive and interpret others' behaviors. So this vision of a prosocial human potential is really needed for a more transformative development approach. And so in my paper, I argue that this requires the faculty to, one, recognize that prosocial behavior and potential is a part of human nature, and that human nature is not just selfish and conflictive. And then two, to embrace the dual nature of human beings, learn to work effectively with the mix of self-serving and collaborative behaviors that we see. So just to share a little bit, I discussed it, of course, in more detail in the paper, but ideals. People need to be aware of the centrality of ideals in human development and have a hope that humanity can strive towards those ideals. Dr. Arbab wrote that the vast majority of humanity considers spirituality to be their main reference for meaning and motivation. So we should not downplay the importance of religion here. Then Irvin Laszlo wrote that both religions and ethical worldviews do embody the needed values. Emil Durkheim wrote that if one loves his country or humanity in general, he cannot see the suffering of his compatriots, or more generally, of any human being, without suffering himself and without demonstrating consequently the impulse to relieve it. So we can draw on a number of sources in our discourse engagement to encourage this idea of prosociality. And this wonderful statement by the Nguni people of South Africa, when I look into your eyes, I see myself. I am you. To be kind to you is to be kind to myself. I am you and you are me. I am because we are one. So then we also have to understand the importance of frames, language and discourses. We perceive the world through frames. It's a way of selecting, organizing, interpreting, and making sense of a complex reality to provide guideposts for knowing, analyzing, persuading, and acting. So we know about the importance of worldviews, paradigms, and so on. The expression, that's just human nature, it evokes a culturally coded set of meanings, attitudes, and beliefs that self-interest is inevitable. And economic students end up becoming self-centered while studying theories of Homo economicus. So we need to change the discourse from rational economic, self-serving man to social, adaptable human beings. And we need to be open to prosocial behavior when it happens around us. Like, for example, can you identify anyone who exhibited love and empathy? I should hope so, but it's very often visible in emergencies where we see people working in solidarity and helping each other without a lot of hidden motives. And Bregman finds from a study of 700 disasters that most behavior seen in those settings is altruistic, and crime actually drops, and people work together to support the well-being of the community. But then the second component of working with this framework is to understand and embrace the dual nature of human beings and the complexity of human nature in order to strengthen prosociality. This can be strengthened by acknowledging that people are motivated by a mixture of motives. So we have a little angel and a devil speaking in our ear, and recognizing the diverse and evolving nature of people's capacities. Each one of us is not fixed in one mode. Social influences are crucial. That's where we come to the community, and leaders and institutions create systems and set expectations of others. So that's why we have to add the protagonist component to this prosocial idea. And here's one formulation. There are a few devils and angels. Most people are honest but sinful. They want to be honest, but they're highly impressionable, so they're looking at others. And a corrupt individual like this one right here can influence others and tip the balance towards systemic corruption, where the whole system reinforces an attitude and a behavior of corruption. So the idea of protagonists is a way of really drawing on the energies of each individual community and institution. In 1999, the House of Justice said, systematic approach to human resource development is seen in three protagonists of the Bahá'í plan: the individual, institutions, and local community. Now in the 9-year plan, the House is asking us to aim to focus on releasing the society building power of the faith, requiring a rise in the capacity of the protagonists of the plan. Each has a part to play. Each has capacities and qualities that must be developed, and their powers are multiplied by strengthening their dynamic relationships with one another. And that's in that important message, 30 December 2021. Paul Ampel wrote that, then what are the attributes of these protagonists? What are the capabilities they must develop? What are the characteristics that allow them to participate in building a new civilization? That should be a 2004 publication, his book. Then the culture of learning that has been developed in the Baha'i community can serve as a reference point for wider society. in the field of global development. So how do we translate these ideas into the development field? Well, I really am arguing that the empowered participation of the protagonists of development is essential. And I think policy and thought in the development field has evolved over the years, focusing at one time or the other on these different levels of individuals, institutions, and communities. But it's rare to find a consistent and cogent articulation of how these must integrate to facilitate the advancement of civilization. There are informative experiences of Bahá'í-inspired development organizations we can draw on, such as Fundayak. Those at the ABS conference will have the benefit of learning about this, Noor University, Four Worlds Project, and many others. But there's other wonderful experiences in the world that we need to draw on to help build a framework to analyze and structure our efforts to strengthen capabilities and foster the integration of the protagonists. My Frontiers article suggests an exploratory approach where I've drawn on development experiences and theories such as the UNDP and USAID capacity strengthening approaches. I also draw on the policy network theory, which I used in my PhD dissertation research to analyze stakeholders in terms of membership of policy networks, integration of those members, the resources they bring, their interests and ideas. So I put forward a suggested way of analyzing them in terms of this matrix along the lines of several dimensions. So the identification of the protagonists, first of all, which protagonists should participate, which individuals, which communities can participate, including sub-community groups when I refer to communities. And then we look at the dimension of their knowledge, cultures, and value that they bring with them into a development setting. And then how do we figure out how to connect with them where they are at? So know what values, beliefs, and educations the individuals have, what are the cultures of each community, and how are diverse values expressed in that community, and then what is the organizational culture and knowledge of the institutions involved. A third dimension is agency, or in other words, the protagonist's autonomy, choice, resources, and influence that they can deploy. What agency and resources does each individual bring to the situation? What is their interest and motivation? What right are they claiming by participating in development? So all of these things have to be considered. And then what is the mandate of each institution in this regard? The mandate means what power have they been, or jurisdiction have they been granted to engage in that particular area of development? Do they have agency within a context of multi-actor, multi-level governance structures? So in developing countries, this is what I found, that a municipal or a national government has to deal with a number of other entities and policy networks. And then just briefly on other dimensions, stance. What is the stance that the individuals bring with them into an interaction with other protagonists? Do they expect prosocial behavior from others? And how do they accommodate it? Are communities and individuals fostering participation and emphasizing postures of learning? So that's about the attitude and their stance. Or do they come with sort of a pre-established agenda they want to push? And then the roles and functions. Now, this is an obvious one, but is there a provision for evolution in the roles of the different protagonists? And how will that be monitored and determined? And that's so important in the context of development, where we have really this grassroots learning emphasis of trying to empower local protagonists increasingly. And the relationships. What are the mechanisms for participation, transparency, and accountability in those relationships? How do they deal with corruption and conflict? And finally, learning. How will the protagonists learn during the process? Is there a social community learning? Is there an institutional learning process? So this is what I've elaborated somewhat in the article. And how can this be used? Well, it's not a blueprint. It's not a training curriculum. It's something that can help initiate and guide processes of capacity strengthening and development of curricula, potentially. It could be a reference to be used when working in organizations or partnering with others. And I mentioned a few examples, such as the OECD Learning Compass 2030, which has some quite encouraging aspects. It could be used as a framework to analyze experiences, useful for evaluation. I can draw on it in my evaluation work, or to stimulate further research. So what are some of the conclusions? Well, importantly, I feel we need to give hope and practical optimism in our discourse engagement while we read our challenging reality in the world. And we must urge people to redouble our efforts to reach the Global Development Goals. My experience in class, teaching and using this article, the idea of prosocial protagonists seems to resonate with students in their own journeys for engagement and thinking about how they will contribute to global development. It helps them to crystallize a positive view of the future, first and foremost, because all of them are really wavering in that area. There's a lot of negativity in academia. It makes a change in the chip about what is the center of development. The protagonists need to be localized. So rural and urban communities in the Global South are increasingly seen as leaders in their own development process. And despite worries about climate change, students are ultimately motivated to work themselves and to help others to work for sustainable development, other protagonists. So the idea of prosocial protagonists, or some variation thereof, you don't have to love this terminology, but it seems to be one way to conceptualize and convey the Baha'i teachings, which I feel we can share with others. And I encourage people to develop such ideas in their own fields and discourses. And Baha'i communities are really well positioned to promote this kind of optimistic, practical, deep approach to global development, and have a range of activities that we can continue to promote learning. So thank you very much. And these are some of my references. You can take a photograph if you want, but I appreciate your time.